So, essentially what Niamh and I are talking about in sort of, I suppose, talking with Dave and our partners, is we're talking about Step Change Project, which is, we kind of touched on already, but it's essentially a very large, multi-stranded project which is intended to intervene in debates about sustainability, behaviour change, mobilities, transport studies, particular sorts of transport studies and transport modelling. And there's a particular QLR element to it, which is the part that we've been doing at CRESC in Manchester. And that's sort of, you can kind of see it there on the slide. It's a 5-year qualitative longitudinal study. We've got 4 areas in Leeds, 4 areas in Manchester. It's a panel of 240 people split between the 2 cities with complete contact over 4 years. We're currently just in the first wave of this, so it's still there. We're not really talking about the longitudinal aspect of it per se yet, and so we haven't quite got to the clarity part of Dave's equation, because we're still going. But part of, as Dave mentioned, part of the aim of the QLR aspect is to help develop an empirical basis from which Dave and his colleagues can help develop new sort of transport modelling paradigms and sort of, I suppose, try and get at the kind of things that Dave was working towards, modelling change and modelling long-term futures. So essentially we're bringing together these different disciplines, different units of analysis and different ways of dealing with time. Well, obviously we have quite different methods, but there is this aspect of time which differs between the two sides. I suppose these two elements of the project. Qualitative research often is dealing with, we're simultaneously situated in the past and the present very often. We're talking to people in the present about their past and ongoing experiences, and that's a fairly well accepted part of qualitative research. Whereas what Dave is doing is that particular kind of transport modelling often works with model present and with model futures, and at times with really long-term model futures. And the agents in these futures, as Dave touched on, are often sort of rational individuals who don't really have a history per se. They have particular rational ways of behaving in these situations. So that's just some of the contexts in which we're working, and the sort of different conceptions and ways of dealing with time, which I'll touch on quickly. So I suppose one of the contexts in which we're working, and one of the things we're engaging or intervening with is the mobilities literature. So although Step Change is this kind of meeting between qualitative research and this largely quantitative modelling, partly quantitative modelling, there's also these different notions of time, duration, at play in some of the qualitative literature in which we're working with and which we're engaging with. And one of those is mobilities literature, which is a sort of emerging field. Mobilities is often being seen as, well, the way it works is often it's largely spatial. They're more concerned with spatial rather than temporal movement, although there is a concern with, I suppose, particular kinds of day-to-day routines like commuting, which has a very short span. But particularly in the work of John Urry, who's sort of one of the big names in mobilities, he does have a particular concern with time and duration because he talks about the present as a kind of radical rupture from the past. So this present state of mobility and mass movement is a radical break from the past. But at the same time, well, at least for us, this kind of depiction of rupture or epochal change is a little bit hazy on duration. Particularly, it's not always clear when this present begins. When does the present begin? When does modernity, this mass movement, begin? But what I mean by that, and one of the things that we're grappling with in part, or we're sort of working through, is for people like Urry, or I think Elliott and Urry, which is a fairly recent book that came out talking about mass movement. Mass travel and urbanisation is seen as a kind of present moment, but one that sort of starts in the early 20th century. So the whole of the 20th century and early 21st century is like the present. It's the present moment of mass mobility. But then they're also talking about more specific recent markers of the present, one of which is the sort of post-1990s rise of information technologies and communications technologies, which has given rise to a kind of individualised person-to-person network, which they say has begun to eclipse this, what they call the door-to-door communities of the past, which are sort of spatially compact communities where people knew each other and they worked and socialised in small, sort of geographically compact spaces. When this past is again, not quite clear. and nor is it really clear who's, if this past, given that it still exists, if it's really the past or whether it's in the present. So essentially, historical events or trends in this are sometimes presented as points in a sequence which leads up to the present, and potentially, for Ari, also leads up to a potentially apocalyptic future. Sometimes they're a backdrop to the present, they're the environment of the present, and sometimes they're all markers of this big single present, which is this modernity characterised by mass movement, where everyone's moving around, things are moving around, information's moving around. This is not necessarily a problem, as such. There's lots of different ways of cutting up historical events and historical sequences. But the sharp conceptual divisions between past and present, with the lack of clarity about when they begin or end, and who counts as in the past and who's in the present, is not especially helpful in this particular context that we're working in, addressing the complexities of specific, locally grounded changes and continuities in travel and transport behaviour. Dave's talked a little bit about modelling as well, but this is one of the other contexts that we're trying to work with, and it's it's unusual for us as qualitative researchers to try and work with these models. Transport models, they very often work in the short term, they sort of do day-to-day dynamics of road transport, but as Dave mentioned, there is a sort of part of transport modelling which works with these long-term futures, 20, 30, 40 years, which is quite different, but at the same time they have, as I've sort of gathered from Dave and cribbed from things that I've read by him, limited ways of talking about change. In part because they have these ideas of the agents within the models don't really move very much. Some external factors might change in a fairly deterministic way, like sort of economic conditions, gross domestic product, that kind of thing. But the people within the models don't really change. They have a sort of fixed, predetermined essential behaviours, which don't really change over time, or change very gradually, which in a way the models don't really take into account. So it doesn't give much freedom for modelling change. I'm sure Dave can say much more about that. But I suppose the other part of that is that at the same time there is a notion of the past, because any change is modelled is an extrapolation of the present and the past, so it's kind of projected forwards into the future without really a sense of change in time. It's sort of just moved in the way that Dave was talking about. Sorry, I'm just really whizzing through this because there's a lot going on. The other aspect, I suppose the other context that we're working with, is a particular part of transport studies that we've found quite helpful in trying to bring these aspects together, I suppose, which is called mobility biographies. And this is an explicit attempt within a part of transport studies, which is trying to bring depth into transport studies. Outside of the modelling side of transport studies, there is, I suppose, other attempts. A lot of the work is cross-sectional. People do travel diaries. There's the National Transport Survey, which is a sort of weekly diary of transport. There's a very cross-sectional approach as well. People write about weekly travel. Mobility biographies is an attempt to give depth to that by looking backwards and getting this notion of people's movements through time over the life course. So rather than being cross-sectional, it's sort of a life course approach. And it's either through panel studies or more often through retrospective interviews of people's lives and the sort of changes in their life that have led to different changes in mobility. This is a useful starting point for us, but I suppose again, from a sort of qualitative non-transport studies side of this, there are limits to this as well, because it's perhaps a little bit too serial. They have fairly linear notions of causality, in that one key life event leads to a particular change, another key life event leads to a particular change, and then a stable period of, you commute to work because you've just, moved house, or you get 2 cars because you've both got the jobs. So there's a very sort of, still fairly linear notion of serial events that lead to big change. And there's also a focus on concrete events, transitions, and key moments within this kind of literature. And that's a risk in the way that we're talking about life history as well, is that you identify key points which occur and then lead to big change. But identifying what that means, identifying what a key moment is and how long it lasts, or what is a transition, is actually not that straightforward in practice. So just before I hand over to Niamh, I'll just briefly mention, so the stage that we're at now is really just in wave one of the study. The sort of first round of interviews with 240 people. And what we've been doing with them is partly cross-sectional in a way that we can repeat serially over the years, which is a travel diary, a weekly travel diary, which is a fairly conventional instrument in parts of transport studies. But we're also doing life history, residential histories, mobility histories, and a series of timelines as well, with people who are recording their life in a fairly linear way over the course of life, by the use of a timeline, but also more impressionistic kind of life accounts, and also through what's called life diagrams, where people sort of sum up their lives by using a diagram. So we were trying to bring together these different ways of looking at time, and the way people order time, I guess, across their lives. And then just hand over.
So we just wanted to provide a little glimpse of some of the data that we've been gathering to give some sense of where we're at. And so I'm going to show some extracts here from one of the people that we've interviewed, Laura White, 40-year-old woman living in North Manchester, so just a couple of miles north of here. And as Stuart said, we're really just at the end of wave one, so this account is based only on one interview. But part of what we're doing, I suppose, is in terms of this question about what's the L in the QLR, is that it's not just this kind of the repeats and the returns, but also trying to bring in attention to kind of time in the method, so time in modelling, time in QLR, but also time within people's narratives and how people are dealing with time. So that's partly what I'm picking up here. And the other thing is obviously, a few quotes. This is from one interview out of, we're aiming for 240 at the end of the first wave. So in kind of presenting this, these pieces here, obviously there's no intention that this is generalizable or representative. So rather we're really just using it to try and show the limits of the kind of current approaches that Stuart's outlined, and to try and kind of gesture towards what we're hoping are the possibilities of a more kind of interpretive or narrative approach. So a kind of attempt at a kind of demonstration of our method. And in many ways, Laura is kind of atypical because she's not a car owner or a driver substantively, and she has this very strongly articulated identity as a walker. However, part of our interest is really that her narrative strategies are not so atypical. So through her narrative, she refuses certain versions of kind of linear time. So that's kind of particularly clear for our illustrative purposes here, but it's kind of consistent with things going on in some of the other narratives. And I guess partly what we're interested in doing here is also kind of bearing in mind kind of undermining this account of herself that she provides repeatedly throughout the interview of herself as a walker. But just to move on from this account, when we asked, which is actually Stuart, so Stuart carried out this interview, about it, but when she was prompted to produce a kind of life story, these are initially some of the things that she said. So she repeatedly stressed basically how fallible her memory is, and in fact, that it was completely limited. So in terms of the mobility biographies approach that Stuart's kind of outlined, I mean, that literature has a kind of intense kind of concern with validity of memory, and has to kind of triangulate and kind of produce kind of real accounts of memory. So from that kind of perspective, Laura's account might be completely discounted, as in she's already discounted herself by insisting that she can't remember anything. But I suppose what we're interested in is how people tell stories. So there's already kind of repetition going on in Laura's narrative. So we've already had a repetition of her story of herself as a walker, and now there's this kind of repetition that she can't remember anything, which is beginning to kind of suggest the kind of importance and meaning that she kind of attributes to things rather than that she really can't remember anything. And what's interesting then is that when she's prompted in the interview to produce, beyond this, to try and produce a life history, I mean, against her kind of almost refusal of it, she produces this big long account, and the point of putting all of this up here is not that you're intended to, not expected to kind of read this. But actually, it's to show that when she's forced to, well, not quite forced, but prompted to, she can and does produce a quite serial chronological account of her life. So she does understand what she is being asked to do. And she understands that she's kind of refused something, but then she does kind of produce that in response to kind of further prompts. And so this is a kind of quite long account of different jobs and courses that she's done and college work with kind of dates and times and durations of jobs. So she can produce this kind of account. But the other thing I think that's interesting about this here is that she also shows an awareness of what she's been asked to produce, because right at the end she says, 6 months later I was diagnosed with breast cancer, and that's up to the present day. Not much going on in my life, darling. And I think what she's kind of signalling here is that she's produced the account that she was asked to produce. She's produced the serial kind of chronology. But she realises that the kind of life transitions that might be expected in that kind of account she can't quite produce, basically, in the end. So this story of breast cancer that appears kind of really briefly here is actually really significant in her account. But it kind of interrupts the kind of standard life transitions that the kind of mobility biographies approach is looking for. So Laura is not married, she has no children, and she's no longer got any fixed employment, and she doesn't really have an easy employment or educational history to tell. In fact, it's quite kind of fragmented. It's not a kind of progress narrative. It's not a story of things getting better. And you know, what appears is that the cancer is not it's not a one-off event. So there's this kind of question of what's an event and what's a transition. Because she says then the only thing that she can remember is that she's had cancer for 6 or 7 years, and that's the time period that kind of matters to her. And in this sense, you know, against a kind of serial account of life that the mobility biographies approach is kind of seeking, what we have in Laura's account is an account of something that's enduring, basically, and something possibly that she has to endure. And she produces this kind of truncated kind of narrative where there is no time really, there's no memory before the cancer, and there's a kind of ongoing continuous present of 6 or 7 years of cancer. And it cannot yet be forgotten because it isn't yet over, so it can't yet be relegated to that kind of period of everything else that she doesn't remember because it's, you know, because it's remaining. And so, you know, in this sense of trying to kind of pay attention to Laura's kind of rhetorical strategies and kind of the structure of her narrative, kind of against this kind of attempt at a kind of realism in the mobility approach, we kind of see that we get a sense of her account of time and how, you know, that can be kind of reduced to the kind of serial. And it's difficult really to see how the mobility biographies approach could really deal with her life at all, because there just aren't these hooks and transitions and events that people look for. And it's also really difficult to see how transport modelling you know, can engage with this kind of life story at all either. And I suppose this is where we're at. I mean, as Shirley said, we haven't really got to the kind of clarity point yet. But I suppose for us it's this point about using QLR as a kind of intervention, and QLR's attention to temporality, and a very kind of broad, I suppose, a kind of complex account of temporality, and not just a kind of repeat cross-sectional version of temporality, as a way of making an intervention into existing paradigms around mobilities, modelling and mobility biographies. Because the other thing to say is that, you know, in the rest of Laura's account, she's produced the story of herself as a walker. She lives in the near her parents where she grew up. She mostly has quite a kind of local kind of range of mood, and so she has this kind of endless story of she walks to the shops, she walks to visit her mother. She can drive, but she doesn't have a car because she can't afford one. But she actually has extensive international travel as well. So she's visited all kinds of places like Hong Kong, Jamaica, Caribbean, Spain. She contemplated moving to Cyprus at some point. So she has kind of quite an extensive international mobility. But at the same time, if we think about the mobilities paradigm that Stuart introduced at the beginning, it really raises questions of, is she part of this movement, this present moment of mass mobility or not? Or is she a kind of remnant of the past, a stable enabler of the kind of global elite? And do broad generational epochal characterizations help us kind of understand her trajectory? And so it's not sure that the mobilities paradigm really helps to understand her life either. And and again, neither the kind of mobility biographies approach and neither kind of does it seem that modelling can really help with her life. So I suppose this is kind of where we're at in terms of the end of the kind of first wave of looking at these stories that people are kind of producing about their narrative and seeing how we can might be able to use them to make an intervention into the kind of temporalities that are implicit in these kinds of other ways of thinking about mobility. I was going to say one other thing, which I've just forgotten. Yeah, that's fine. Anyway, yes, I'll leave it there. Okay. Oh, I suppose the final point was just, that partly what we're producing is a kind of evidence base that kind of contradicts the assumptions rather than the evidence that goes into some of these other kind of paradigms. So they're not very kind of evidence-based, actually. They're kind of based on a whole range of assumptions. So in the first instance, I suppose we're hoping for this kind of disruptive effect of the evidence that doesn't actually correlate with the models in any way. And whether we get to clarity, is a kind of come back in 3 years' time. Thank you.
I think that's great, actually. Sort of, so it's maths plus qualitative research equals disruption.
It's been the clarity.
Just to explain to those who came in late that we have done a little bit of reorganising of the programme. Just put that up again so you can see. Because of delays and things like that. So you may have been struggling to understand what was happening. So this will explain to you. We hadn't expected to start with an empirical example. We were thinking of going in through the kind of more abstract theoretical. But actually I think it's really interesting to start with more the empirical so we can kind of work backwards and forwards perhaps more than we might have done. So perhaps it's even better something that's happened. So we will be moving on to the next session, but there's time for just a couple of comments or questions to Niamh and Stuart. But also remembering that we can come back to things over the course of the day. That's going to be an ongoing conversation. Anything anyone particularly wanted to pick up now? Yeah, Karen.
Something that Lee said I thought was really intriguing, and I think there's far more she could say, but not in the time probably. But could I ask anyway? Your account was drawing very much on a sort of narrative approach to analysing temporal complexities, which I thought was really, really interesting. But at one point you said that her narrative didn't involve the hooks and transitions and events involved in life course, or I think you called it mobilities, biographies of mobility. What about cancer? It seemed to be that was a huge hook and transition in terms of how she accounted for her life temporally. So you were saying two things, both of which seem to be contradictory, and I'm sure you can explain it.
Skating over things a little bit quickly. I guess in terms of this mobilities biography approach that we found that Stuart kind of outlined, I suppose when I was talking about this, she doesn't have the hooks. She doesn't have the hooks that literature uses, which are, I suppose, are kind of conventional hooks around marriage, children, jobs, education. And I suppose Stuart you were also talking about how those events are treated as this kind of discrete event. So cancer is clearly a hook in her story. It's just not one that kind of lines up with the existing mobility biographies approach. And I suppose what we're trying to do is kind of expand in some way this kind of emerging approach in the transport literature to have a more kind of qualitative, interpretive, kind of narrative approach to people's biographies and what kind of matters to them. So in that sense, we totally agree that cancer is the hook, but that the existing mobilities biography approach couldn't kind of deal with that in her narrative, and probably could also kind of relate it to her use of transport either, you know.
Yeah, I suppose it depends what you call an event. For her, this is the cancer is a kind of event. It's not a singular point in her life, of course, or life history. It's sort of ongoing. You know, it's an event that has continued for 6 or 7 years and doesn't have an end yet. And so it doesn't have a singular outcome either because it has a range of outcomes.
It's a major transition in terms of the sense making, the narrative sense making, but not in terms of a life event model.
Yeah.
Okay, that's great.
Yeah, this is one dimension, or one approach within the panel study. You know, collecting life stories and analysing them, and looking at this issue of a particular frame for understanding the mobility of biography. But I remember David putting up something about the multiple methodological approach that this project is trying to generate. And of course the key thing is how, when you bring different ways of seeing to bear, that clarifies or obscures or communicates further. I just wondered if you had any comments about the notion of a mobile methodology to interrogate some of the issues about transitions, events and consistency.
Well, I guess in the first instance my response to that would be around, Andy's on the team by the way, just because we haven't introduced him properly. It's back to what Stuart said about the mobilities paradigm, is that there's a question around, I think, the ability to engage with time, I suppose. So that mobile methods are often kind of in time moments and deal with kind of short periods of time. And so there's a sense that kind of contributes to a quite short-term time frame in a lot of the mobilities research. And I suppose this thing that we're interested in, taking this thing that's very banal for any qualitative researcher in the room, that you interview somebody in the now and might ask them in some way about their past. That's kind of, I think, utterly banal for many of us. But by bringing that into kind of conversation with modelling, then it becomes, or kind of thinking about transport futures, then it becomes kind of very interesting because it's not the usual kind of approach. And transport modelling doesn't deal very well with how people's pasts and how people understand their pasts might influence their travel and transport and kind of mobility imaginaries more broadly, kind of now and in the future. Yeah.
I don't know if I'm allowed to make a remark as well, but just as a real-time example of I haven't actually seen that presentation before it was given. I don't think I've seen that. Well, I might have forgotten, but I don't think I've seen that transcript before even. So, but from what you presented, it did suggest a lot of interesting things to me. Just in a few minutes, I was listening to it. For example, I mean, in the approaches we normally use, people don't get ill. And we don't know what they do, but physically and psychologically, and if that's an important factor in the way they deal with transport, it seems logical it is, it seems we should think about it. And then we can think of, well, you know, we can think about everything. Is that particularly important about looking at some futures? Well, it seems it probably is. If we've got an ageing population, probably a greater percentage of people will be physically limited, and probably, this is just a spur of the moment thing, so I think this is where, that doesn't tell us how to actually deal with that, but it suggests an issue that we should then think about. So I think this, to me, is an example of the kind of creative drive that this sort of work can give to all the disciplines. And viewing it might seem perfectly normal and not worth thinking about. It might be quite radical. I don't know anybody who has done a transport model where people get ill.
I think that's probably a perfect place for us to move on to the next session. Thank you. Thank you both of you.